Well, hello, my friend. How are you doing?
Great in this crazy land that we're in.
It is literally insane.
Yeah.
And we have so much to talk about.
We do. How much time do you have?
Man, tell me about it, right? Let's try to keep it concise, but it's just so much. And I know that you have been going through so much and leading our community as we've been in these uncharted waters. So,
well, the feeling is mutual, my friend. You've been doing the same. I'm happy to be able to do it right with you.
Thank you. Thank you. So you are a viral sensation now. It's so exciting to hear how your talk has blown up to over 2 million views. How does that feel?
I can't believe it. Yeah. And who knew in 2019, when I thought all I needed to be talking about was how to be an ally, would turn into I need you to be a verb, not a noun.
Right.
Need you to be an active ally or an accomplice. Who knew this was going to happen? But, you know, at the same time, I think it was such a timely talk, but I had no idea it would be viral.
Yeah. Well, the theme for this whole TEDxMileHigh is Uncharted. And so it has been uncharted. I mean, 2020, which has been completely uncharted. We have no idea what we were getting ourselves into. So thinking about your talk then and now, what has changed in this uncharted landscape that we're in?
You know, even in 2019, I realized that people really were interested in knowing how to get engaged. They were already asking those questions ahead of a lot of the crises that happened in 2020. So I knew even at that moment that it was a galvanizing time in history for us to be thinking about how we might take what we thought was justice into what we needed to do to advance justice. And the talk really was born out of that. And then I got to be really honest with you, I'm aging. And as I age, it's important for me to start telling stories of the past so that we have context for what we're doing. And my talk was really contextually around some stories of my past as well.
Yeah, it was a really beautiful talk. And especially as you overlay like your past and how you grew up and where we are now. So you've recently had a name change.
I did.
Well, tell me about that.
I'm reclaiming my name. You know, my story is I was not born Nita. I was born Dwinita, Dwinita. And it was told very early on in my career from a mentor that was white that my name was not going to work.
It's too black, huh?
It was too black.
Yeah.
And that people would decide who I was, how to evaluate me based on that name. And it was in that era that I cut my name in half and became Nita. And I've decided that there's been a lot of pain in my life because I never was whole, even in my own name. And so reclaiming everything in my life is important, but my name in particular. And I've decided now's the time to do it.
I think it's so amazing. When I saw you post about that on social media, it really did like stir something up in me, like how this year we have really changed the shape of this country, but it hasn't been without struggle and without some also internal reckoning of who we are. And so reclaiming your name in the midst of this fight for racial justice and this racial reckoning that we're in right now, I mean, it was empowering to see someone who were already empowered by saying that I wasn't whole until I reclaimed my name.
Yeah, it's so true. You know, I've been thinking about, and I bet you have too, in all of the wonderful work you're doing across the country and in our state. We are a country that's used to normalizing things. Yeah. And we will normalize even the worst things and figure out a way to navigate around them. We just are resilient in that way. And I think in many ways, my name and other things that we could probably all list are examples of us normalizing things because that's what we do well in this country. Yeah. I say we got to get to the point where we want to be accountable for things instead of just normalizing things, and to be accountable for racial justice and accountable for people being able to be wholly and fully who they are. That's where we ought to be right now.
So what does that look like? I mean, we use this word accountability a lot, We're going to be accountable in this or that. And so what does accountability look like in this era?
So I have this debate a lot with my young children. And I have to tell you, I've got one answer to your question. I'm probably oversimplifying it. I think you can't be accountable if you don't know what the systems are doing in the first place. I think at a cursory level, we know that our systems in the U.S. were not built with equity in mind. Mm-hmm. We know they weren't built for people that look just like you and me.
Right.
We know that part.
Right.
What I don't know that we know deeply is how intricately tied one system is to another. And so to dismantle one system really can create another effect in another system, because I think they're all webbed together.
Absolutely.
And we've got to go deeper on the interplay between the systems. I don't see us doing that as much, and that's the work that I'm really interested in.
Absolutely. I mean, during this time of COVID and racial reckoning, I think we have seen the inequalities around police brutality, right? Just rise up to the top. But we also see the inequalities in healthcare, right? In our healthcare system and in education and in so many other sectors are really bubbling to the surface. They've already always been there, but they're bubbling to the surface, and they are connected. And so this past summer of protest was not just about one thing. It was about all of that interconnected systems that we really do need to work on changing. I know I'm committed to that work, and I know you are too. So yeah. I just want to say thank you for continuing to speak on that.
Well, thank you for that. And I think the more people like you and people like me can begin to talk about the intersections of the system flaws, the better for people. We can't solve this one system at a time. We have to have a strategy for looking at the interconnectedness of the system so we get it all done at once. I don't want our children to suffer in the education system because we're over here talking about policing. We should be able to see the relationship between the two, and healthcare and housing, and it goes on and on and on. But the more we can talk like that, and I know that you do that in your work, but the more we can get everyone acculturated to talking like that in that intersectional way, I do think we'll have equity in our sight line, at least in my lifetime.
That's amazing. I love that hope too, right? Like we can actually make change, right? If we think about things a little bit bigger, right? And more connected at the same time.
Yeah.
So I love that. So you mentioned your conversations with your young folks, and I'm dealing with some youngins as well. But it really was them out front of these protests and, out in front of this conversation this past year in a way that I don't quite remember in my lifetime. And I think it's really empowering and amazing to see that our country is going to be led by these young folks, right? I mean, that is hope. But I've also felt like there was something missing. And for me, that's been our elders, folks who have mentored me and guided us through really hard times in the past, just haven't really been as much of a conversation as before. What do you think about that, and how are folks who are young and in these protests really going to connect with our elders for that wisdom that we need?
Well, I appreciate you, first of all, saying what you're saying. I can't believe I'm getting ready to say this because I've known you so long that I now can call myself your elder.
I don't know. I'll take it, but there's definitely a lot of respect there.
I think that's right from an age standpoint.
Yeah. Well, you don't age, so whatever you want to say.
I love that. I appreciate you saying that. Well, here's what I think. I agree with you 100%. I was so proud to see what young people across the globe were doing in 2020. And the difference between young people in 2020 and young people of the past is this is a generation of young people that do not see this work as optional. It's not an episode. Yeah. It's not a snapshot. And I love that. That's where my hope sits, in that it is not optional. But when it comes to elders and the missing link, because I agree with you there too, I do think it's missing. I think the thing that's missing is we haven't painted the face of who the new elder is. Interesting. So I don't think the current elder is the old elder. I think there's a new set of elders, but we're not calling them that. And so I think we miss an opportunity to engage their wisdom and their storyline. And I don't want us to miss that generation. I'm sitting in the boomer generation, And there's a 1960 story that's really relevant. It's where I grew up. It's really relevant to what's going on today, but we're missing, I think, that middle elder story because we're looking for the elders that came before us because that's what we're accustomed to. So I think we're going to have to engage differently what eldership looks like. And I think we've got to get more people to operate in many ways, like our young people are. This is not an option kind of work.
You know, in this time, especially during the movement for Black lives and just the rise of conversation around Blackness and anti-Blackness, I sometimes can have a myopic view of the conversation. My lens is Black, my lens is queer, and it's female. But there are other communities that are going through this journey with us. And you actually work with a lot of different communities, a lot of different backgrounds. So tell me what you're seeing in your work and kind of what communities need that might be different and might be the same.
Yeah, I appreciate that question because I think it's something we don't talk enough about, and it is the nuances in different kinds of communities around the topic of anti-racism, Blackness, white supremacy. So my work, fortunately, takes me around the globe, which is a lot easier when you're virtual. But I get to work with sometimes communities that you don't expect to be doing this work, like in some cases, rural communities that are actively in anti-racism work, where the audience is completely white. Sometimes the audience is completely conservative, yet we're in conversations about what it is to be an anti-racist organization and what it is to be anti-racist. Those particular communities, I can't generalize, but generally speaking, those particular communities are just at a different part of the continuum of understanding, a willingness to do something and not all of the tools to understand what they need to do. Sometimes that means we have to go backwards and play back some of the history in this country around anti-Blackness. That's the work that I do. And then sometimes I'm in a different country, where you would expect that maybe things might be a little different than they are in the U.S., only to find out that some of the things are exactly the same. And so in those cases, I will adapt anti-Blackness conversations to what's going on culturally in that country. I just recently did some work in Australia. There is a race and ethnicity issue to tackle there, and lots of healthy dialogue about how to apply it. When it comes to BIPOC communities, now we are the leaders in knowing all about our own oppressions.
Right.
We are scholars in that. And so we don't need to necessarily hear that, but we need to hear the other side of the story. What is that other side of the story of anti-racism work? What are white people doing? And how often are they getting to hear those stories? So I get a chance to work in all kinds of pockets of people across the globe. And for me, to be able to put that tapestry together gets at some of the systems work that I think we have to do. We have to stop generalizing that there's one way to do it.
Right.
Because there are multiple ways to do it. The theme is the same. We want to eradicate anything that's anti-Black.
Right.
That's the common thread. Right. How you go about doing it really qualifies itself based on actually who you're working with.
Well, tell me about that. I mean, I think the thing that I hear the most questions about is, how do I have a conversation with someone who is denying that racism is even real or anti-Blackness is even real? How do I have a conversation with that person? So can you give me one way to have that conversation?
Yeah, I think whenever you have a person that's in denial about a thing being true, the question is whether you really want them to understand it or do you need to win this debate? Yeah. And right, and so in many ways what I find is when people are operating, one set of people operating in anger because this is pain, and one set of people operating in denial, sometimes not because they don't believe it's true, it's because they can't hold the guilt of being complicit in it. Oftentimes, that's really what it is. When you've got both of those emotions happening at the same time, you will likely get these polar opposite views. I try to get at that right up front in my work. I walk into the work saying, Some of you might not even believe this is a thing. So rather than me try to convince you that's a thing, let me show you what institutionalized and systemic racism looks like in a system. Let me show you. And typically what I will do is take a fact from the past and roll it forward. The problem is people hear us say systemic and institutionalized racism, but then we can't put our finger on what it looks like.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to deny. Yeah. So for example, you know this one well, if you take polling taxes from the past, just take polling taxes, meant to disenfranchise Black voters, roll it forward, roll it to 2021. What do we have as residual from polling taxes of the past that exist today? Yeah. And when you do that, Leslie, people can name gerrymandering, redistricting,
voter ID laws.
They can name it in seconds, just like that. Yeah. So I take the fact and roll it forward. That's how I get to people that deny that things exist. You have to show them the residual of something in order for them to understand it.
Yeah, I love the roll it forward. I think that's something that we can all remember. And then in these conversations, try to figure out a way to tie that link. Start with something that we commonly understand, like we all know and commonly understand that this type of racism existed back in the past. But do you know how it's carried forward today?
Yes.
That's a great way to approach it. So my last question is, a lot of this has taken its toll on Black communities especially, but all of us in kind of reliving this trauma, right? Or scraping off those wounds. So what are you doing to heal and to stay whole in this conversation so that the work can roll forward and continue?
I really appreciate you naming what people are feeling. We are in a cycle of grief, and you just called it out. And I think the more we can call what we're feeling what it is, then it's easier to do something with it. So I am clear that in particular in this country, Black people are in grief. And I use the cycle of grief for my healing. And it just depends on where you are in the cycle of grief. I'm in this stage called bargaining in the grief cycle. It's where you start to try to make meaning out of things that kind of don't make sense. It forces you to tell your own story a lot more, and it forces you to ask people to tell their stories. That's what happens in bargaining. That's where I am. And so my healing is staying pretty astute about where I sit in the grief cycle and where I'm seeing other people in the grief cycle. Denial, anger, depression, acceptance right before they move out of the grief cycle. So I think the more we can pay attention to where we each are in the grief cycle, it's actually easier to know what our relationships can be and what our relationships need to be.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm going to have to think about where I am in that cycle. I think that's a great way to put it too. All right. Well, Dr. Nita, my friend, thank you so much for this conversation. It's always good to sit with you and to share a space with you. So thank you. And thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks.